Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, even good night if you're coming in from Australia. I know that webinars attract a global audience, and a lot of people in Australia stay up a lot later than we do to learn. Yes, obviously this is a very popular topic to do with CPQ employments. CPQ deployments are actually a really tricky topic. I've heard about them from multiple people that work with CPQ, and I'm delighted to host this webinar on behalf of Salesforce Ben with Salto, because this team, these guys, they know so much that's really valuable to the whole ecosystem. Oh, from Brazil. Yeah, good afternoon from Brazil. I always think that Brazil's actually quite close in time zone to Europe. I remember when I went there before, I was like, oh, not that much jet lag. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, I wonder how many. We don't get a lot of people from Latin America. So I'm from Costa Rica, right? Which I don't know why people don't consider Costa Rica Latin America. When people say Latin America, they always think of the South America. But anyway, we don't get many of our kind in webinars. It's hard. Like we get some from Brazil and Argentina sometimes, but I like to see some Costa Rican representation.
Yeah, you've got plenty of biodiversity in Costa Rica, don't you? We've got Kenya, we've got Malaysia, Chicago. Wow, really global. Grenada.
Nice.
Another one from France. Amazing.
Yeah.
India. Yeah, so I told you, we've got APAC here.
Look, somebody was married in Costa Rica. Nice. Great.
And great stuff. All right.
I'm happy.
So just a couple of housekeeping rules when we get stuck into this webinar. This is being recorded and it will be shared afterwards. So, obviously we're going to have a lot of information, a lot of really useful information in this webinar. It will be shared for you to then go back and fully digest it in your own time. And there will be a Q&A at the end. But obviously put in your questions that you want answered. I know for a fact that Pablo and Dennis here, they have a lot of knowledge. So do you guys want to be tested?
Yes. And just a comment there that you can put questions on the Q&A, like a formal question, but also if you want to put something on the chat that, like if you have a question about exactly what we're showing on the screen, just put it there and we'll stop if we can and try to answer it on the spot. So we want to make it as interactive as possible. I know death by PowerPoint is very painful, so I don't want to do that. So let's, if you have questions or comments, please put them on the chat.
Yeah, we don't want to make it as painful as some CPQ deployments.
Yeah.
Great stuff. All right, Pablo, do you want to take it away?
Okay, cool. So we're here to talk about best practices and hacks for CPQ deployments. Just a quick agenda. We're going to give a very short overview of Salesforce CPQ in case some of you are not familiar with what it is. We're going to talk about CPQ deployment challenges. We're going to go over some pre and post deployment things that you need to consider in the form of a checklist. Then we're going to see what CPQ deployments look like with Salto, and then we're going to go over some tips. So just to introduce ourselves, my name is Pablo. I'm the director of Salesforce DevOps at Salto. I've been in the ecosystem for around 13 or 12 years. In your typical roles, I was an admin, then developer, architect, and I've been focused on Salesforce DevOps for the past 2 years. So Dennis.
I'm Dennis Palmer, author of morecpq.com. Been doing CPQ implementations and enablement for probably 8 or 9 years. And yeah, really like this tool.
Yeah, we'll talk later how it has invalidated so much of your flows and things that you thought to be true. Right. So just a quick intro to Salto, because I recognize many of you won't know who we are. I'll keep this very short. We do DevOps for business applications. So we don't do just Salesforce. We do Salesforce and CPQ very well, but we do it the same thing for other apps such as Zendesk, Jira, Okta, NetSuite, Workato, etc. So everything you're going to see today applies to those business applications as well. So if that's interesting, let us know. We focus on different use cases, but at a high level, we can help you find, configuration in your org, such as hard-coded values, IDs, email addresses. We also do compare and deploy, which is the focus of today. We also have full-on CI/CD and version control. And that's it for the ad. Let's move on to Salesforce CPQ. So just a very quick overview of Salesforce CPQ, what it is. It's a quoting tool choice for Salesforce, right? It's about managing your products, being able to configure products in different bundles, managing prices based on different conditions. And it's very, very powerful, which is one of the reasons why it's complicated as well, because it's very declarative. You don't have to code anything. Everything can be built through the Salesforce UI. Now, who is it for? It's for customers who need to send, PDF quotes to their customers. So if you have complex configuration and pricing needs, and they need to standardize their quoting process. Now, Dennis, I want to ask you, because you could have all these requirements and still not need CPQ. So what's kind of the tipping point where you say, actually, you know what, I do need CPQ versus just building my own simple, product lifecycle stuff in Salesforce?
So there's a lot of kind of shortcuts that CPQ gives. There's a couple major ones are the pricing engine, where if you have complex requirements that you need some automation to happen while you're quoting, CPQ has this crazy pricing engine that you can add rules to. Similarly, with your bundle structure, I would say if you have any bundle structure at all, CPQ is probably the best place to go, because a lot of the other tools out there, the out-of-the-box things that Salesforce offers, don't really do bundles very well. Never mind some of the automation that you can have within a bundle. So
great. Okay, so don't try to reinvent the wheel. Okay, another aspect of Salesforce CPQ is that it has a configuration data approach. And what that means is that you don't really configure CPQ through the setup menu. You actually modify or create records of custom objects that are part of the CPQ package. So that's kind of the overview. Now, when we are talking about CPQ deployments, we're talking about the act of deploying or migrating or moving CPQ data across different Salesforce orgs. That's what we mean with CPQ deployments. Now, there are different reasons you may want to do this, such as maybe you're doing a sandbox seeding, right? Maybe you have a dev sandbox and you work in a CPQ environment. Your dev sandbox by default is only going to have products. So basically, you don't have any product, price rules and all the bundles. Everything will be pretty much empty. So you would have a pretty useless sandbox. And so you may need to deploy production CPQ data into your sandbox, and that is a CPQ deployment, right? You may also do the reverse, where you actually have CPQ data in a UAT environment, for example, and you're doing some testing there, some new functionality, new bundles, new price rules, and at some point you want to deploy that to production. Also, it may be the case where it's a little bit of both, and you've been doing different configuration on different sandboxes, and your sandboxes are out of sync when it comes to CPQ data. So this is very problematic because creating a quote in different sandboxes would result in different behavior, so you can't really test things well. So you may need to have something to keep that configuration data in sync. Now, deploying CPQ is hard. There are different challenges. So one of the first ones is that there are too many objects. I took this screenshot from an architect blog. If you're the owner and you see this, thank you. This is actually this is not the whole picture, right, Dennis? There's a lot more objects than this.
There's so much more, yeah.
Yeah, so this is kind of like the tip of the iceberg in terms of CPQ, but so it's a lot, right? So even just kind of reasoning about it, right? I need to deploy CPQ data, and you need to think about so many different objects and so many relationships. And that means, which objects do I deploy first, and do they already exist in the target environment, and stuff like that. So that on its own makes it very complicated. And also it can have, there's a lot of, honestly, very weird configuration in CPQ where you have field names hard-coded as picklist values of other CPQ fields, right? And that's because CPQ is all about declarative customization, right? No code. So, it's kind of taken to the extreme sometimes, and you end up with this very strong, very weird kind of hard-coded relationships where you have the API name as a picklist value of some other field. And what that means is that's a dependency there that you actually have no idea. If you delete that field or if you change those picklist values, there's nothing that will tell you that those two fields are actually connected, right? And really the biggest problem is that this is really, what I say is that this is data that wants to be metadata, right? It is data, it's just records of custom objects, but for all intents and purposes, this is metadata. This is data that affects the runtime behavior of your Salesforce org. And so it's so important, but it doesn't have the benefits of Salesforce metadata, such as, being able to version it in Git, or being able to do a rollback if something goes wrong, or being able to have some sort of review process before you deploy to production, or even understand dependencies between data. So all these 3 bullet points are things that we can natively do with Salesforce metadata, but it's not possible with CPQ data, even though conceptually it is metadata. So you're kind of stuck with, having to do manual deployments or use data loader, and it gets very complicated very quickly.
So Pablo, Dennis,
yes.
Someone asked a question I think might be quite relevant to talk about at this point. So is there any not good pieces of advice about CPQ deployments that you hear, that you might hear them on social media and you just wish maybe you question them, or people are maybe not evangelizing but spreading misconceptions about CPQ deployments?
I think probably not, but the one thing that I don't see enough people talking about, so kind of the reverse of that question, is that if we go back to this, again, CPQ data is metadata. The only reason is data is because the guys who created the package were constrained by the limitations of managed packages in Salesforce. That's it. If it had been a Salesforce product from scratch, we would be, well, this webinar wouldn't exist, first of all. And we will be configuring CPQ through the setup menu, and we will be deploying that through chain sets, and then the whole world will be fine. But it's not. It is really metadata. So what people don't talk enough a lot about is that, when people think of CPQ deploying, they're thinking of data migration, right? Like is your typical data migration. And yes, of course, it is data migration, but the data is not just opportunities or leads or your traditional data. So I think there needs to be you kind of need to really treat this data the way it needs to be treated, which is as metadata. And obviously I'm biased because I'm with Salto, but you can also use other tools that are not Salto and still treat CPQ as metadata. So it's not about using Salto for CPQ as metadata. You could use something else, but it's the mindset that needs to change and say, okay, you know what? This is actually metadata. It's not just data. Sorry, that was a very long answer, Dennis.
No, absolutely. It makes sense. I know you're about to go on to the planning aspect, but Dennis, do you want to add anything from your point of view?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people are afraid to post advice about CPQ online because it is so complex and difficult to do. But I would like to see more, people talking about it and like giving some of their success stories. And here's something that worked for us. Like Pablo said, you could use Salto, but there are other tools out there that treat the data like it is metadata, which is great. But I think when I first started in CPQ, I was like, it's all custom objects and related to each other, and there weren't no tools. So, you had to do it with spreadsheets and formulas and that kind of thing.
That is crazy. That is
Yeah.
crazy to think, isn't it? I know for a fact with people that, you know, have told me about their experiences, it's like you have to find a quiet period in your org if you don't have a proper tool. Even when you do have a proper tool, sometimes you need to find a quiet period in your org where there are no changes to data. And if you're running a global company, that's really difficult. So obviously the planning aspect is really important.
Right.
Yeah.
Great. Dennis, I think this is your part. So
Yeah.
I'm gonna stop sharing.
Sure.
You can share your screen there.
Let me do this one here. There we go. You see it?
Yes.
Okay, good.
All good.
So, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I said all good.
Oh.
Yeah. Do you want to go into full screen?
So, yeah, let's see. Is this not full screen?
No, it's fine though. We
Okay.
can see the navigation bar, but
Yeah, it's okay. We can
yeah,
see it well.
we can continue.
So, yeah, we're talking deployment planning. So, I would say with any deployment, you really should do some sort of planning, even if it's a small migration. You should do some planning to decide what you're moving. So for this scenario here, we're going to assume that this is a new implementation of CPQ. Happy Soup Consulting wants to move their CPQ from UAT to production. And all of the CPQ data has been put into this UAT box, and we just want to move it to production. So we're going to talk about the planning for what needs to happen for this scenario. So we've created a checklist. It's the only checklist you'll ever need. It's in a Google Sheet. And this is essentially kind of a template that I use when doing any deployment. And, if there's things that need to be more simple, they can be more simple. If they, we need to add some steps here and there, we do that too. But this is kind of a starting point. So what do we do? So this is a pre-deployment checklist. So first you want to talk about the schedule. When are we deploying? Sometimes deployments go after hours. Sometimes it's on the weekends. Sometimes, like Lucy said, you have to find a quiet time in your org when nobody's there. But there are times when you can deploy things during the day when there are users. It really depends on the things that you're moving. So think about your schedule. The next thing is a backup strategy. So when you're moving, and I think this is kind of even just for a broad deployment, you want to back up your existing production org before you deploy so that you don't, if something really bad happens, then you have an easy backup plan to say, let's restore from our backup. Make sure that people that need access to your backup have access to it, that kind of thing. Let's see here. So we also have a testing script kind of steps where you design your after deployment test script. So what are you going to do to validate that the deployment is successful? Which tires are you going to kick? What users are you going to grant access first and have them go in and mess around with the things that you built? That kind of thing. So make sure you have some sort of testing to do after you deploy. After that, we have disabling some of the automation. So Your deliverability can, when you deploy something, if you have automation in there, it may trigger some emails to go out that you don't want to go out. Other things like in the package settings for CPQ, you can disable triggers so that the CPQ triggers don't happen. So if you're deploying some things that might make your price rules happen on all quotes, we don't want that to happen. So you do disable a bunch of things. And then having a change log. So having a tool to do a deployment for you, an automated tool, can be useful in creating a change log. So a lot of these tools out there will essentially compare your orgs for you, and then you can use that as your change log. It will say, here's what's different, and you can kind of whittle down to what you want to deploy, and that's your change log. But there are other things that aren't necessarily deployed that you might want to still keep track of. So making sure that you have a change log kind of plan methodology is important.
Right, that's funny. That is right, because when we first spoke, you showed me this huge kind of document that you had for change logs and how you track all the changes that you made. And now that you've been using Salto, you're like, everything I thought I knew about the word is false. Because Salto kind of becomes your change log. It already tells you everything that's changed and who changed it, when it was changed. So I never thought about it that way, probably because I'm too deep into the product every day. So it was funny to realize that we effectively replace your change log.
Yeah, when I first started using Salto for deployments, which was like 2 weeks ago, my change log got so small, very, very short. So thank you to the tool. It's very nice.
Right.
Pablo's going to go through deployment with Salto, but after, we do have a post-deployment checklist as well. So there are also another checklist that you can go through, a starting off point to go through and do post-deployment things.
Yeah, and we can go over those if there's a bit more time. So let me share my screen so I can move on to the part where it gets a little bit more, well, I get more nervous because I need to do a live demo. Can you see my screen again?
Yes, we can. Thank you, Pablo.
Great. So, all right, so CPQ deployment, some expectations is you should deploy some metadata first, right? So if you're deploying metadata and data, sometimes that data depends on the metadata, right? So if you have new custom fields and those fields are populated on those products or CPQ records, naturally you have to deploy that metadata first, or it just makes more sense to do that. Relationships need to be maintained, right? So if you have products and price rules, you need to import the product first, then the price rules. Obviously, you can't import the price rules without the parent products. And then also data should be inserted in the required order, right? Which is basically what I'm saying. But you also need to take into account, what if some records already exist and it's not a brand new deployment? Maybe it's half, or maybe, some records do exist and I've made changes, but some of them are new. Now, this is what in general would take you to do a CPQ deployment manually, right? You need to take all of this into consideration. So if you use some of these methods, for example, there are free open source tools to deploy CPQ data. We have a few blogs on the Salto website on how to do that. So again, we want you to use Salto, but there are other ways that benefit, the smaller customers. And so with some of these tools, you do need to take a lot of those things into account. What data needs to be deployed first? How do I match external IDs? How do I, maintain the relationships. So if it's a one-off deployment that you need to do and forget about it for the next 2 years, I 100% recommend you to go to the Salto blog and read this article so you can learn how to do that one-off deployment. If you're more serious about deploying CPQ data, that's when you need Salto or something like Salto, right? So the approach here is that we can deploy CPQ data like metadata and alongside metadata. So I want to emphasize that it's not a data migration tool. Yes, it is data, and yes, it is being migrated, but it's not an exercise of taking thousands of records and migrating them to another org and move on. Really, it has an approach of data as metadata. So, and I'll show you exactly what that means in a moment, but it's really about treating this data the way it actually wants to be treated. It also has other capabilities such as the where is this used functionality, right? Where are these product rules being used, or what are the relationships of these products? It has typical metadata features such as deployments, rollback, Git version control, pull requests. And then, but naturally, this is not for everyone. So this is for teams that are serious about managing CPQ implementation at scale, right? And so what that means is you're deploying CPQ changes constantly. You need to keep those changes in version control. Maybe you work for a regulated industry and you have to have an audit of all your CPQ changes. Or maybe you just have a very large implementation of CPQ and you just cannot afford not having a formal process for deploying CPQ data. So some of you can use Salto for CPQ and metadata, but we also have some customers that just use it for CPQ. So we're also very flexible, right? It's not a CPQ tool. It's also not just a metadata tool. You can do both, but we're pretty flexible in terms of what you want to use it for. So let me show you the live demo then, and let's see if the demo...
Sorry, Pablo, just while you're getting that up, I just want to remind everyone, keep dropping in your questions. It's a great opportunity to ask these two experts. Yeah.
And yes, and now that I'm going to show Salto, please feel free to ask questions as well. Okay, so this is the Salto UI. So what I have here are my different Salesforce orgs. So I have 2 orgs, CPQ Webinar 1 and Webinar 2. So the scenario that we described, right, it's a brand new implementation. It's a greenfield project. I wanted to do it a little bit different. So what I'm going to show you is that in my target org, which is this red CPQ Webinar 2 org, I have a product called Laptop 15 inches, but that's the only product I have. That product also exists in my source environment, but I have a lot of other stuff. Well, you only see that product now, but I have a lot of other products, and that product also has a lot of, it has a bundle, right? So it has features, has options, it has the other, I think that those are the only 2. There may be a few other related objects. Yeah, here, costs, etc. In the target org, that product is pretty much empty in the sense that it's just a product, and the bundle, or the products that make up the bundle is missing. So let me show you how you could deploy this in the data as metadata approach with Salto. So I'm going to go here and click on compare and deploy. And I'm going to create a new deployment where I'm going to say my source is CPQ Webinar 2 and the target is, CPQ Webinar 1 and 2. So let's call this Salesforce Band demo. And now what you're seeing here is a table showing you all the differences across your 2 Salesforce orgs, across everything. It's not just CPQ data. So you could use this to deploy fields, profiles, page layouts, Apex classes, but it also includes CPQ data. So what you're seeing here is that we don't have a separate product for CPQ. It's not like we have a separate approach for CPQ. It is exactly the same experience as deploying Salesforce metadata. So I could go here and deploy, for example, this Apex class, or I could deploy products as well, and the experience is exactly the same. So I could, again, this is the screen that replaced Dennis' changelog, because what he did is he was able to say, okay, you know what? I want to see all the products that were changed by me, from this date to this date. And that's it. That became his changelog, right? So I could say, show me all the, let's say here, products that were changed by me in that range, and that's it. You don't need to document those things manually. So let's go ahead and search for that. So here's the laptop product. You can see the icon here that this is a modification, which means Salto knows that the record exists in both orgs, but something is different about them. So let's see what's different. So what you can see here is that in my source org, there are 4 changes or 4 differences. So it appears that the configuration event, the configuration type, option layout, and the taxable field are different. And one of the things that I really, really like about Salto is that I can choose which changes to deploy, right? So I don't need to do a complete override of the product and say, okay, I'm going to migrate this product from A to B. I can say, I just want to deploy these 2 changes out of 4 because these are changes that are relevant to the deployment that I'm doing, right? So maybe somebody changed this in UAT because they were testing something, but it's not something that you want to deploy. You have 100% flexibility on deciding what actually gets deployed. For those who are more technical, this is what is called semantic merge. It means that we understand the semantics of the configuration here. We're not just doing a blanket, deployment or override. We understand what's happening here. Okay, so let's say I want to select only these fields for deployment. And because I have selected the product, now Salto is telling me immediately that, hey, this product has 11 things that are related to it, and maybe you also want to include them. So if I click on that, those related items are the bundle records. So I have one cost, I have the 3 product features, and I also have the product options. So you can see how quickly Salto highlights those dependencies for me, and I can just select them just like that. So all that stuff that I said earlier about understanding the order of the relationships and which record to deploy first, that goes out the window. You don't need to think any of that. We do all that for you automatically because we understand the entire kind of tree or graph of your relationships. Now, an interesting thing here is that product options are actually a junction object, right, Dennis? Product options are not, they're just saying this product has this other product as an option. So selecting the product options is actually not enough because that's just the kind of the junction. I still need to deploy the object that they're pointing to. So Salto very quickly highlighted this as there are 7 missing dependencies. So because I selected this, there are 7 things or 7 elements that I haven't selected that are required for this deployment to succeed. So if I go here and I remove this filter here, we see that these are the 7 products that are there because of the product option that I selected. So again, Salto is very good at telling you, hey, this is required because you selected a product option, and that product option is looking after a product that doesn't exist yet in the target environment. There's a question there, how can you tell which instance you're looking at? So I've created these instances before. So when you configure Salto, you connect to your different Salesforce orgs, you give them a name. If you go to the configuration, you can see the username. So that's how I know kind of which instance this is. Now, the smart dependency, there's a question there. Are the smart dependencies for all out-of-the-box objects in the managed CPQ package? Yeah, for everything. Doesn't matter. If we know that the relationship exists, then we'll show you that dependency. So let's go ahead and select that, right? So I've selected the missing dependencies. So now I have everything. I have the product and all the kind of CPQ related records that make up the bundle. A question that's been asked recently is that, what if I'm deploying this one by one, right? Like this would take way too long. And so if you go here, you can always just select the entire checkbox and then just select every single CPQ record that you want to deploy. I'm choosing not to do it simply because I want to show you the specific, features. But if you want it, you can do a mass, let's call it migration, and deploy the entire data set in one go. Okay, so let's say I'm happy with my selection. It's the product and the bundle. So I'm going to go here and click on preview deployment. There you can see a very nice animation of Knuckles, which is our pet. So while that is happening, there's checking if there are any questions here. that are possible to
There
answer.
were a couple. I think one that maybe we can answer now. Is it possible to deploy the configuration rules related to the product with variables, error conditions, and such?
You can deploy every single CPQ record that has ever existed and will exist. This is not limited to. So actually, this has no limitations whatsoever in terms of what you can deploy. I'm going to be honest with you. We're doing this CPQ webinar because we know CPQ is a popular use case. But actually, what you're seeing here works for every single data or configuration data app that Salesforce supports. So you could do this for field service lightning. You could do this for Health Cloud. You could do this for loyalty management. Any data that should be treated as metadata, Salto works out of the box with that. And you still don't need to create relationships. You don't need to tell us how those things are related. We do all the mapping behind the scenes. We're focusing on CPQ because we know it's such a strong pain point, but if you have data deployment needs of other configuration data, this works as well. And yes, it includes velocity. Again, velocity is just another version of data as metadata. So that there are really no limitations to this. We purposely built this in a generic way. So again, it's being honest here. It's kind of a marketing thing, right? To say CPQ deployments, right? Because we know the pain is there. But this was built from the ground up as a generic way to treat data as metadata. So if anyone in this webinar has the same needs for velocity or even custom objects that you created or something like Conga, this works exactly the same way.
Yes,
anyway.
Sorry, I don't know if you saw that other question when you mentioned Conga. Obviously, we're not
Speak to the other question.
We're not going to mention other vendors, but someone's talking about migration. But go on, Dennis.
So this question seems to be asking about migrating from Oracle CPQ to Salesforce CPQ, or Conga CPQ to Salesforce CPQ. And the answer to that is those two things and other CPQ solutions to Salesforce CPQ, that's a bit of a project because you have to say they're two complete different sets of objects. So you would need to make a mapping of your functionality in one tool to the functionality in another. But I would say when you do that and you define your Salesforce CPQ in your sandbox, then you can use a tool like Salto to migrate.
Boom. Let me move on just in the interest of time. So the deployment preview is ready. So what that did is it automatically created a pull request on GitHub. This could be the Git provider of your choice. It doesn't have to be GitHub. We support every single Git provider, even on-prem as well. And so again, we go back to this theme of data as metadata. This is not a data migration exercise. So what you can do here is now you can actually review the changes that you're deploying, right? So we'll show you the actual text representation of the CPQ records, and you could do anything you wanted here. You know, for example, let's say I go to this product and I see, hey, why are we changing this from add to always? That doesn't make sense. And I can go here and tell my colleague here, are we sure this is correct, right? So now you actually have a proper review process to treat your CPQ data as metadata. You could also attach automation to this. So if you want to create a validation deployment against the next environment or static code analysis, if you included Apex in this, you could also do that. This obviously is also optional. So you don't need to use PR. So if your use case is just really deploying from A to B, that is also 100% supported. But we think it's a very nice add-on to be able to have pull requests automatically created for you so that you can review that data and keep it in version control. So let's say we're happy with it. Somebody else reviewed these changes and they're good with it. So then I can come here and then just click deploy and push. Dennis spoke earlier about disabling CPQ triggers as a pre-deployment item. So again, Salto is aware of that. This is probably one of the very few things that we have hard-coded to CPQ, because I did say that our approach is a bit generic, but we know, okay, this is CPQ data, so we're going to remind you that, hey, you may want to disable your triggers before you do that. So then if I click deploy, and if the demo gods are with me today, this should work. Let's see. So what's happening now is, no, there's nothing magic here. Now we're using the Salesforce API. Well, there is a bit of magic, which is I never had to specify external IDs. I never had to tell Salto what the data set should look like or which relationships to deploy first. When Salto fetches your configuration, we build an entire graph of everything, and we just know how it's supposed to be inserted. So I think that worked. So I get a reminder to re-enable triggers. It's a successful deployment. So if I go now to my target org, and again, there are no features or options or anything, and if I refresh, everything should be there. And look at that. We have the features, we have the options, including the relationships or that kind of the junction object there. So I'm very satisfied with this demo. Also, we are now kind of deploying or pushing that to GitHub. Again, this could be the Git provider of your choice. We were basically creating a commit. So let me show you what that looks like. It's very similar to the pull request, but it's going to have additional details like the name of the deployment, the source, target, who deployed that. And there's also a link to this auto deployment that you can always go back and deploy. Now, one thing, again, going back to this data as metadata, is that if I have multiple CPQ deployments, multiple CPQ sandboxes, like I have integration, UAT, pre-prod, and then production, I don't need to do this one by one or repeat the same exercise for each environment. Every deployment in Salto is kind of like a commit where we remember the before and after values that were applied on that deployment. So I can select multiple deployments here and say, okay, now, you know what? Now I'm going to take these deployments, which is kind of like cherry picking, and I'm going to promote them to another environment. And what Salto is going to do is going to apply the after changes. So it's you can think of it as a cherry pick exercise for non-developers. And again, this would be very, very hard to do with data loader or something like that, because you're thinking of data. But if you change the mindset to think of metadata, then all of this becomes possible. Version control, promotions, cherry picking, semantic merge, etc. Right. Okay. Let's move on quickly then, because I know we're kind of out of time. So that was the demo. So these are just simple tips, kind of, very small tips for a successful CPQ implementation. Know your process, right? Basic, but why are you really using CPQ, which is something we hinted at earlier at the beginning of the webinar. Just because you have products or a complex product doesn't mean you necessarily need CPQ, right? So you need to understand, is CPQ really a good fit for me? Do we have the skills in-house to maintain CPQ? Another thing is data integration, right? CPQ data doesn't live in a vacuum, and it could span different systems. Like you may have a product bundle that in NetSuite looks different, even though it's logically the same. But maybe the finance team wants the product to be spread out into different bundles or something else for, financing purposes. So you also need to think about how is this data going to live or be reflected in other systems that may need access to it. Find a good partner. Dennis, I want to ask you about this. What is it recommended that you go, can you implement CPQ on your own? And I'm not trying to say go for a consultancy, but I'm sure some people can, but what's kind of your take on that? Should you go for a consultancy, or should you try to do it yourself with Trailhead and stuff like that?
So it would definitely take longer to do it yourself, unless you're a CPQ
unless you're you.
Yeah. If you're a CPQ person and you're comfortable with it, it's just like anything. If you're not comfortable doing it yourself, or learning it yourself and then doing it, then definitely seek out the help of someone who can kind of fill that gap.
Right. And then this is a very simple trick that a colleague of ours mentioned to us is that if you're not using Salto, if you're using some of the other open source tools that I shared earlier that you can find in the Salto blog, such as the Salesforce Inspector or the Salesforce CLI, and you do a CPQ deployment, how do you know that everything got deployed? Just count how many products you had, how many product rules you had in UAT, for example, and then just do the same count in production. Do they match? That's a simple, very simple SQL query, very simple exercise to make sure that your data migration at least didn't leave any records not migrated. This is kind of a preview of what these tips are. So we actually have a whole article written on this. So there's a QR code there. If you're interested in learning more about, top 5 challenges for CPQ implementations, you can go to that QR code. If not, again, just go to the Salto blog and you can find a lot of this stuff there. And that is it. Thank you, guys. Lucy, do we have time for questions?
We do. Pablo, do you want me to share that link for the checklist with everyone?
Yes, please.
Yes, I'll put that in. But while I'm doing that, oh, there we go. All done.
No, that's another link. Somebody
that's another link. Okay.
Yeah, it's a link to the article that I just shared about.
Okay. Wow. Loads of freebies on this webinar. Wow. So I know, Dennis, you answered a question inside the Q&A chat while Pablo was presenting. So it was about if Salesforce changes CPQ triggers, how are they managed, since you mentioned there's no hard coding. Do you want to explain the answer, Dennis, just for everyone's?
Yeah, so the thing that Pablo mentioned about the hard coding is really just a reminder message at the start and end of this deployment to say, hey, reminder, you're probably going to want to go turn off your CPQ triggers. It doesn't do it automatically for you. You have to go and manually go shut them off. It's this hard coding is a kind of a reminder.
Right. There's also a question here. Alan, you asked, does the deployment hold or discard the source IDs and target IDs references? Example, when deploying the product option object. I'm not sure I understand your question, but I'll answer how Salto handles IDs. Obviously, we have to manage that in some ways. It's not dark magic. By default, we have a configuration where, following the theme of data as metadata, we assume that your CPQ data will be created in a sandbox and will then be migrated to production. Or maybe it already exists in production, you seed it to a sandbox, and then you make changes and put it back in production. So under that theme, we actually use the Salesforce ID as an external ID, which I know sounds super weird, but if you have a sandbox that is empty and you do a deployment from production to that sandbox, the internal ID becomes the production ID. And so that creates that link between the two, where now you can deploy back and forth in those two environments. And Salto knows it's the same because it originated from production. Now, that doesn't fit all use cases. So we also allow you to specify field concatenation as IDs. So you may want to say, you know what, that doesn't work for me for whatever reason. So I want products to be identified by the name, family, and product code. So if we find the same match in the other org, then we know that, okay, these records are the same. And we also allow you to specify an external ID that you created. So if you want to have your own external IDs that you manage with a batch Apex job or something like that, we also allow that configuration. So we're pretty flexible in terms of how we match records and how we tell which record is which. But by default, we use the Salesforce ID under the theme of data as metadata. It's very confusing, so I don't know if that makes sense. Okay, you just said that it does make sense, so great.
Real-time feedback. There's another question here. We'll for the purposes of time, we'll just answer this one. So I don't know how long or how much explanation is going to need, how much story we'll need for this one. So what can we do with this tool regarding amending multiple dimensional quoting subscriptions that have multiple start dates, or sorry, different start dates? If it's possible to update subscription, entering the quantity for each segment of the subscription. Does that make sense?
I will answer that differently because there's no, I
can speak to this. So your subscription data is not a part of the CPQ metadata, as data as metadata. Your subscription records and contracts and opportunities, all of those objects are like your user data, the user generated data, and you would use a different kind of, this wouldn't even be a migration. It would be it's kind of like a legacy data migration where you need to amend or renew or whatever the process is. I would do that with a different tool.
Yeah, I agree. No, I just wanted to say that if you just need to do like a mass update, which is also valid, right? Maybe it's a deployment, right? You need to deploy from UAT to production, but what you're deploying is kind of your mass updating your products to something. I will spend 30 seconds on this because I don't even have a demo ready, but when we create a pull request, we actually allow you to edit the files of that pull request in a native web editor, which is basically we open this kind of in like a real-time VS Code. Dennis, I don't know if you've ever seen this. And basically we allow you to modify, like to do find and replace directly in the context of the Salto deployment. It's pretty advanced, but I'm just saying if you really needed to do something like a mass update before deployment or something, you could use something like this. And it's basically using kind of VS Code to do find and replace, and then that becomes part of the scope of the deployment. But that's all I'll say about that, because it's a very different use case, and there's not enough time to go over it in detail.
Lots of things to discuss though. Future webinar. Sorry, Dennis, were you going to say something?
No, I'm good.
Is multi-dimensional quoting something that gets you up in the morning, gets you out of bed?
MDQ, yeah.
Good stuff. Well, thank you, Pablo, and thank you, Dennis. We're getting lots of feedback just saying, how helpful it was, and I agree. I learned something. Well, actually, I learned a lot. So yeah, good job all, and thank you everyone for your questions. And any final thoughts, Pablo, Dennis?
No, well, just thank you very much, Lucy and Salesforce Ben, for letting us host this webinar. I hope, well, I can see from the chat that it's been very helpful, and that makes me happy. So that's it. Thank you very much.